This tutorial is to demonstrate sewing and binding an MCC comforter. Before moving ahead with this tutorial, please refer to MCC's blanket making tips to help with selecting fabrics and learning other criteria that you should be aware of before making blankets for MCC. So after selecting your fabrics, you will cut them into squares following the straight of grain and lay them out in a pleasing pattern on your workspace. After designing your comforter top, place a label on each row at the very bottom edge of the first square. Stack the squares of each row in a pile. Stack each row on top of each other, keeping the first row on top. We stack the squares in a pile like this so that they can be easily moved to the sewing machine and sewn from top to bottom. It is also easy then to set them aside as a kit and return to sewing them at a later date. So beginning with the top square, sew your rows together. Row 1, once it is completed, gets sewn to row number 2. Row number 2 can get sewn to row number 3, and so on. When we're making backings or linings for the comforter, if you have a small piece of fabric that you need to make bigger by using a complementary fabric, please make sure that the border is equal dimensions all the way around the outside. So now we're sewing the rows together. You start at the top, backstitch a couple of stitches to lock your corner, and with your needle down and your presser foot down, you will match up your first corner. So the goal is to try to have one seam allowance facing up and the other seam allowance facing down at each corner. This helps to create a nice smooth corner and makes it easier for the comforter knotters to get through the seams. Keeping your needle down at each corner, get your next square ready to sew. Hold it carefully at the following corner, and again, aim to have your seam facing down and the back seam facing up, or vice versa. So matching up your raw edges, sew again to the next corner. The goal here is to make sure that at each corner you have your needle in the down position while you readjust the following square and match up the following corner so that you get a nice square corner at each intersection. When you come to the end, backstitch a couple of times to lock your seam. Notice how nice and square the seams are when we take the time to adjust them before sewing. Notice again how we have the rows at the top. The numbers are very near the top of the square so that you can easily determine in which direction you should be sewing. Once you've sewn your comforter top, it can be matched up with a lining and the knotters can knot it. Once it's been knotted, it gets taken out of the frame and trimmed ready to bind. When you're preparing your comforter for binding, please trim the batting to the same dimensions as the top. The lining, or the back of the comforter, can be trimmed about 1.5 inches to a maximum of 2 inches wider than the top. We find it easier to begin on the long side of the comforter and start about 8 to 10 inches down from the top. Fold in once and fold in twice. Move it under the sewing machine needle and try to sew about 1/8 of an inch in from the folded line. With your needle down, prepare the first few inches of your binding, making sure that it's lining up nicely and neat and straight. Sew holding the front and the back to give it even tension. With your needle in the down position, you can then readjust for your next few inches of sewing. Some people will choose to use pins or baste or even hair clips to hold the binding in place while they sew. Others prefer just to hold it with their hands and readjust as they go along. Notice how the needle down helps to keep it stable while you fold in your next section and get it ready for sewing. Notice that we're aiming to sew about 1/8 of an inch in from the folded edge. Now we want to stop about 2 inches from the corner. With the needle in the down position, you fold your next edge in once and twice, folding it carefully, sew all the way down to the outside edge. Again, with the needle in the down position, raise your presser foot, go on an angle and reverse up into the diagonal corner. Now with your needle in the down position and your presser foot up, and get yourself prepared for sewing on your next side. And this is an example of the finished corner. Very neat, and there's no little gaps for bugs to crawl in to the binding. Now we're coming up to the last corner. You want to make sure that you've got the same 1.5 to 2 inches of width on your lining. Sometimes you'll have to trim it a little bit before you sew that last 8 to 10 inches on the last side because it might have shifted a little bit during sewing. So you trim that off and then you fold in again, just like we did with the last corners. Fold in once and twice. Just making sure that you can ease that all in very nicely. Sewing down to the corner. Sewing down to the corner. You want to keep your needle in the down position and reverse up into that other corner again. And again, with your presser foot in the down position, you turn your comforter to the last seam. Ease in any fullness you might have. And when you come to where you began, you do a couple of reverse stitches to lock your seam and trim any loose threads. A beautiful and well-made blanket is so much more than just a blanket to keep someone warm at night. It is also a gift of love and dignity. Thank you for doing your part in providing these beautiful blankets for those who need them most. Thank you for taking the time to watch this tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the link below.